You think you know who's loyal? You don't. You just think you do, until one morning your sister drops two toddlers on the porch of a house you sold months ago. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. I stood across the street, leaning against the cold brick of a corner deli, watching the scene unfold with a sense of detached amusement that only years of dealing with Sienna could produce. She didn't even wait for the doorbell to be answered. She just unbuckled the kids from their booster seats, gave them each a juice box like she was arming them for a crusade, and pointed toward the mahogany double doors of 412 Larchmont Way. Then, she hopped back into her white SUV, the one with the top-rated realtor decal on the rear window, and peeled away, leaving a faint scent of expensive perfume and scorched rubber in the morning air. The problem, of course, was that I hadn't lived at 412 Larchmont for 3 months. I'd sold it to a high-strung corporate attorney after my business partnership with Marcus Hale hit the skids. I now lived in a fourth-floor walk-up with a view of a dumpster and a leaking radiator, but Sienna hadn't bothered to check my last 3 emails. She only reached out when she needed a free sitter so she could go network at a mid-morning spa retreat. My name is Sawyer Beck. I'm an architect by trade, which means I spend my life obsessing over structural integrity. I look for the stress points. I calculate how much weight a beam can carry before it snaps. Lately, I've started applying those same principles to the people in my life. I watch the kids, Leo and Mia, age 3 and 5, look around the porch with growing confusion. Mia, the older one, reached up and hammered on the door. I knew exactly what was about to happen. Mr. Henderson, the new owner, was a man who scheduled his bowel movements and loathed any disruption to his sensory environment. Seeing 2 sticky-fingered children on his doorstep was going to be the highlight of his morning. I checked my watch. I had a construction site visit at 10, and it was currently 9:15. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Marcus. I didn't answer. I knew what he wanted. He wanted the final set of elevations for the Pierpont project. The project he had effectively stolen from me by whispering in the ears of the board members while I was grieving our firm's recent financial losses. He was a shark in a tailored suit, the kind of guy who smiles while he's taking the chair out from under you. "Not today, Marcus," I muttered, tucked my phone away, and crossed the street. As I approached the porch, the front door swung open. Henderson stood there in a silk robe, looking like he'd just been insulted by a head of lettuce. He looked at the kids, then at me. "Beck?" he barked. "What is this? Are these yours?" "Technically, they belong to the state of New York, and a very irresponsible woman in a white SUV," I said, offering a tight, cynical smile. "Don't worry, Arthur. I'm just the cleanup crew." I scooped up Mia and grabbed Leo by the hand. They were surprisingly quiet, probably sensing the seismic shift in the adult atmosphere. I led them back to my rusted sedan, strapped them in using the spare seats I'd never had the heart to throw away, and sat in the driver's seat for a moment, staring at the dashboard. The weight of it all, the betrayal by my partner, the constant disregard for my sister, started to feel like a physical load on my chest. It was like a badly designed roof in a heavy snowstorm. Something was going to give. And for the first time in 30 years, I decided it wasn't going to be me. I pulled away from the curb, but I didn't head toward my apartment. Instead, I drove toward the north side of the city, where the new luxury development was going up. The Pierpont, my masterpiece, currently being built under Marcus's name. The construction site was a symphony of organized chaos. I loved it. I loved the smell of fresh sawdust, the grit of stone dust in the air, and the rhythmic thumping of nail guns. It was honest. If you didn't build it right, it fell over. People, however, were far more complex. They could be hollowed out and rotten to the core while still looking perfectly stable on the outside. I parked the car near the foreman's trailer and told the kids to stay put for 5 minutes, giving them my tablet to keep them occupied. I stepped out into the mud, my boots crunching on the gravel. I needed to see the progress. I needed to see exactly how Marcus was butchering my design. "Hey, Beck!" a voice shouted over the whine of a circular saw. It was Clara Monroe, the lead engineer. She was one of the few people who still looked me in the eye after the firm split. She walked over, her hard hat tilted back, wiping sweat from her forehead. "You shouldn't be here, Sawyer," she said, though her tone wasn't unkind. "Marcus is expected on site in 20 minutes. If he sees you poking around the foundations, he'll have a fit." "He can have whatever he wants," I said, looking up at the skeletal frame of the building. "I'm just checking the load-bearing joints on the east wing. I had a dream the specifications were changed." Clara sighed, looking down at her clipboard. They were changed. Marcus wanted to cut costs on the steel reinforcements. He swapped them for a cheaper alloy. He said the safety margins were excessive. I felt a cold, sharp spark of anger ignite in my gut. That was the Marcus Hale special. Cutting corners and pocketing the difference, betting that the structure would hold just long enough for him to get paid and get out. He's going to weaken the whole cantilever, I said, my voice low and steady. I told him that. He didn't care. He's the boss now, Sawyer. You're just the guy who used to be his friend. I looked at Clara. She was practical, a realist. She knew the game. Thanks for the heads up, Clara, truly. Just get out of here before he shows up. He's in a foul mood. Some deal in the city went south this morning. I nodded and walked back to my car. As I climbed in, Leo was crying because his juice box was empty. Mia was staring out the window, looking bored. I looked at their small, sticky faces and then at the construction site. A plan began to form in my mind. Not a plan for a building, but a plan for a collapse. Not a physical collapse that would hurt anyone, but a professional and social one. A controlled demolition of the people who thought I was a floor mat. First, I had to deal with Sienna. I drove to a local park, parked under a sprawling oak tree, and took out my phone. I didn't call her. That would be too easy. She thrived on shouting matches. Instead, I took a photo of the kids playing on a slide and sent it to her with a simple caption. Found them at 412 Larchmont. The new owner called the authorities. I managed to intercept the social worker, but they need to see you at the precinct for a formal handover. I told them you were distraught. See you there. It was a total fabrication, of course. There was no social worker, yet. But I knew Sienna. She would panic. She would rush to the precinct, her hair in a mess, her carefully curated, perfect mom persona shattering under the pressure of a potential investigation. Wait, I whispered to myself, watching the kids. Let's make it better. I blocked her number. Then I dialed a colleague of hers, a rival realtor named Vanessa, who I knew was vying for the same luxury listing on the waterfront. Vanessa, it's Sawyer Beck. Listen, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I just saw Sienna's SUV being towed near the police station. She seemed unwell. You might want to check on those listings she's handling today. It would be a shame if the clients were left hanging. I could almost hear Vanessa's predatory grin through the phone. Oh, Sawyer, that's terrible. I'll look into it right away. Thank you for being such a good brother. I hung up. Layer 1. I spent the next hour watching the kids play. I felt a strange, humming energy in my limbs. It was the feeling of taking control. For months, I had been the victim of Marcus's greed and Sienna's narcissism. I had been the nice guy who picked up the pieces. But the nice guy was tired. The architect was taking over. I looked at my watch. Marcus would be at the site now. He'd be walking through the mud, showing off the progress to his investors, puffing out his chest. I started the car and headed toward the downtown precinct. I wasn't going to turn the kids in to the state, not really. I wasn't a monster. But I was going to make sure Sienna believed I had. I wanted her to feel that cold, hollow sensation of losing everything because of a minor oversight. As I pulled into the parking lot of the police station, I saw Sienna's SUV screech to a halt 3 rows away. She jumped out, her phone pressed to her ear, looking frantic. She was dressed for the spa, white robes visible under a trench coat, sandals clicking on the asphalt. I stayed in the car, the windows rolled up, the kids occupied with a bag of crackers. I watched her run toward the entrance, sobbing into her phone. She looked small. She looked vulnerable. Structure is failing, Sienna, I murmured. My phone buzzed again. This time it was an email from the Pierpont board. They wanted a private meeting. They had concerns about the material adjustments Marcus had requested. Clara must have sent a memo. The irony was delicious. While Sienna was inside trying to explain why she'd abandoned her children at a stranger's house, Marcus was about to find out that his corner cutting was no longer a secret. I leaned back in my seat, watching the sunset reflect off the glass of the precinct windows. This was just the beginning. I had the blueprints for their ruin, and I was going to follow them to the millimeter. Ready for a snack, guys? I asked the kids, my voice calm and pleasant. We're going to have a very long, very interesting day. The hunt was on, and I was the only one who knew the terrain. Sienna emerged from the precinct 30 minutes later, looking like a building that had suffered a localized structural failure. Her mascara was a jagged charcoal smudge against her pale cheeks, and her expensive trench coat was snagged at the hem. She stood on the sidewalk, spinning in a slow, panicked circle, searching for my car. I sat in the shadows of the parking garage across the street, the engine idling with a low, rhythmic hum. I watched her through the tinted glass, feeling a clinical sort of detachment. It was the same way I felt when I discovered a foundation crack. No anger, just an immediate, cold calculation of what it would take to make the whole thing tumble. Beside me, Leo and Mia were remarkably content, having discovered a forgotten bag of animal crackers in the glove box. They were oblivious to the fact that their mother was currently experiencing a total psychological brownout. I checked my phone. I had 3 missed calls from Sienna and a string of texts that transitioned from "Sawyer, where are you?" to "I am calling the police on you" to "Please, Sawyer, I'm scared." I didn't answer. Silence is a powerful architectural element. It's the space between the beams that makes the room feel cavernous and intimidating. I wanted her to sit in that space for a while. I wanted her to feel the weight of the air. Eventually, I put the car in gear and rolled slowly toward the curb where she was standing. When she saw the car, she lunged for the door handle before I'd even come to a complete stop. I kept the doors locked. She pounded on the glass, her face pressed against it, her eyes wide and frantic. I rolled the window down just 2 inches. "The kids are fine, Sienna," I said, my voice as flat as a spirit level. "Sawyer, open the door." They told me there's no record of a social worker. They looked at me like I was insane. Where are my children? They're in the back seat, eating crackers, and they're fine because I happened to be there. But they won't be fine the next time you decide a stranger's porch is a suitable daycare center. "Open the door," she shrieked, her voice cracking. I unlocked the doors. She scrambled into the back, sobbing as she pulled the kids into a suffocating hug. They looked confused, Leo holding a half-eaten cracker shaped like a lion as if it were a shield. I didn't turn around. I kept my eyes on the rear-view mirror, watching her composure continue to disintegrate. "How could you do that?" she gasped, clutching Mia's shoulders. "How could you tell me the state had them? I nearly had a heart attack." "I didn't tell you the state had them. I told you I intercepted the social worker. The fact that you believed it so readily tells me you know exactly how negligent you've been. You've been using me as a structural support for years, Sienna. But I'm pulling the permits. I'm done." "You're being cruel," she hissed, her eyes narrowing as the fear began to turn back into her habitual entitlement. "I'm your sister. I have a career. I have responsibilities." "And I have a life that doesn't involve being your unpaid intern?" I replied. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the precinct. "I'm taking you to your SUV. You're going home, and then you're going to find a real sitter because I've blocked your number on every device I own." "You can't do that." "I already did. And just so we're clear, Vanessa from Shoreline Realty called me earlier. She seemed very interested in that waterfront listing you've been neglecting. I might have mentioned that you were tied up with some legal complications today. You might want to check your emails." The silence that followed was heavy and sharp. Sienna's jaw dropped. She knew Vanessa. Vanessa was a shark who would smell the weakness from 3 zip codes away. By the time Sienna got back to her office, that listing would be under review, and her reputation as the reliable choice would be in tatters. I dropped her at her SUV. She didn't say thank you. She didn't even look at me. She just bundled the kids into their seats and sped off, her tires chirping on the pavement. I watched her go, feeling a strange, light sensation in my chest. It wasn't joy. It was the satisfaction of a job done according to the specs. But Sienna was only the secondary structure. The main support was Marcus Hale, and he was a much more difficult demolition. I drove back toward the city center, the skyline jagged and gray against the afternoon clouds. My phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't Marcus. It was Clara. Marcus just left the site. He's headed to the Blue Room for a late lunch with the investors. He looks like he's about to explode. "Sawyer, whatever you're doing, be careful. He's talking about suing you for breach of contract over those elevation leaks." I smiled. The Blue Room was an upscale, members-only club where the city's elite went to hide from the noise. It was all velvet curtains, hushed whispers, and deals made over expensive scotch. It was exactly the kind of place where a public scene would be most damaging. I didn't go to the Blue Room, not yet. Instead, I went to my small, cramped apartment. I needed my tools. Not hammers or levels, but the digital kind. I sat at my desk, the surface covered in old blueprints and half-empty coffee cups, and opened my laptop. When Marcus and I split, he'd changed all the passwords to the firm's servers, or so he thought, but Marcus was a man of habit. He used the same string of numbers for everything, the square footage of his first successful project. It took me less than 3 minutes to bypass the security. I began to dig. I wasn't looking for money. I knew he'd covered those tracks. I was looking for the subcontracts. I wanted to see who was actually supplying the steel for the Pierpont project. There it was, a company called Apex Alloys. I'd never heard of them. A quick search revealed they were a shell company, registered to an address that turned out to be a laundromat in Queens. Marcus wasn't just cutting corners. He was sourcing materials from a ghost firm, likely one he owned himself, and billing the investors for top-tier industrial steel. It was a classic kickback scheme, hidden under layers of paperwork. I felt a surge of cold adrenaline. This wasn't just a professional slight. This was a fundamental violation of the code. He was building a skyscraper on a foundation of lies and cheap metal. If that building ever faced a significant wind load or a minor seismic event, the consequences would be catastrophic. I downloaded the files, the invoices, the shipping manifests, and the internal memos where Marcus explicitly ordered the alloy swap. Then I drafted an anonymous email. I didn't send it to the police. I didn't send it to the board. Not yet. I sent it to Marcus. The subject line was, Structural Integrity Report, Apex Alloys. The body of the email contained just one sentence. I hope the lunch at the Blue Room is worth the price of your license. I hit send and watched the little progress bar slide across the screen. Then I grabbed my coat and headed back out. I wanted to be there when the notification popped up on his phone. I wanted to see the look on his face when he realized the underdog had teeth. The Blue Room was located on the 32nd floor of a glass tower downtown. I didn't have a membership, but I knew the service entrance. I'd designed the renovation for the kitchen 3 years ago. I walked through the delivery bay, nodding to a distracted cook, and slipped into the service elevator. I emerged in the hallway behind the main dining room. The air here was different, thick with the scent of roasted meat and expensive tobacco. I moved to the edge of the velvet curtains that separated the lounge from the dining area. Marcus was there, seated at a round table near the floor-to-ceiling windows. He was surrounded by 4 men in dark suits, the investors for the Pierpont. Marcus was in the middle of a grand gesture, his hands sweeping through the air as he described the vision for the penthouse levels. He looked powerful. He looked untouchable. Then his phone chimed. He ignored it at first, continuing his pitch with a practiced smile. But the phone chimed again, and again. I had set the email to resend every 60 seconds until a red receipt was triggered. Marcus frowned, offering a brief apology to the men, and pulled the device from his pocket. I watched his face. The transformation was better than I'd imagined. The color drained from his skin, leaving him a sickly parchment gray. His hand began to tremble, just a tiny vibration that made the light catch his watch. He looked around the room, his eyes darting frantically from table to table. He knew I was there. He could feel me in the architecture of the room. He stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over his water glass. "Excuse me," he stammered, his voice thin and high. I have an urgent matter. A site emergency." The investors looked at each other, their expressions shifting from boredom to suspicion. Marcus didn't wait for them to respond. He practically ran toward the exit, his polished shoes skidding on the marble floor. I stepped out from behind the curtain just as he reached the hallway. We stood 5 feet apart. The hallway was empty, the only sound the distant hum of the ventilation system. "Sawyer," he breathed, his eyes wide. "What is this? What have you done?" "I haven't done anything yet, Marcus," I said, stepping closer. I was taller than him, and for the first time, I let that physical reality hang in the air between us. "I'm just reviewing the plans. It turns out your Apex Alloys venture is a bit structurally unsound." "I'll destroy you," he hissed, though there was no weight behind the threat. "I'll have you blacklisted from every firm in the country." "You can try, but by the time you finish the paperwork for the lawsuits, the investors will have seen those invoices, and I think they'll be much more interested in why you're building their legacy out of recycled tin cans." I stepped into his personal space, forcing him to back up against the wood-paneled wall. I didn't touch him, but I let the tension of my presence pin him there. "You took my firm. You took my project. You thought I was just a dreamer who didn't understand the real world of business." "Sawyer, let's talk about this. We can work something out, a settlement." "The only settlement I'm interested in is seeing you carry the weight of what you've built," I said. I reached out and straightened his tie, a small, patronizing gesture that made him flinch. "Go back inside, Marcus. Try to finish your lunch. You're going to need the energy for what comes next." I turned and walked away, leaving him trembling in the hallway. I didn't look back. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was calculating his exit strategy, trying to find a way to patch the holes I'd just punched in his life. But he was an amateur. He didn't realize that when a structure is this compromised, there is no patching it. You have to tear it down to the dirt. As I stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. I saw what happened at the Blue Room. "You're playing a dangerous game, Sawyer. Marcus isn't the only one with secrets in this city. Meet me at the construction site at midnight. Don't be late." I stared at the screen. The re-hook was set. Someone else was watching. Someone who knew more than they should. I pocketed the phone, a sarcastic smirk playing on my lips. "Midnight," I muttered. "I've always liked working the night shift." The city at midnight is a skeleton of steel and shadow. stripped of the frantic energy that masks its true form during the day. I pulled my sedan to a stop 3 blocks away from the Pierpont site, opting for a dimly lit stretch of industrial road lined with shuttered warehouses. I didn't want my car's license plate caught on the high-definition security perimeter Marcus had installed to protect his vanity project. I stepped out into the biting wind, pulling my collar up. The air tasted of ozone and wet concrete, the familiar perfume of my trade. Walking toward the site, I kept to the shadows of the scaffolding. My boots made no sound on the damp pavement. I felt like a ghost haunting my own design. The Pierpont rose above me, a jagged obsidian tooth biting into the low-hanging clouds. In my original drawings, it was meant to be a beacon of light and transparency, a testament to what glass and honest engineering could achieve. Under Marcus's stewardship, it had become a monument to opacity and hidden flaws. The perimeter fence hummed with a low-voltage current, a deterrent for the curious or the desperate. I didn't head for the main gate. Instead, I circled to the south side where the trash chutes were situated. I designed the service entrance with a slight structural overhang that created a blind spot in the camera sweep, a detail Marcus had likely overlooked in his rush to prioritize the marble lobby. I slipped through the gap in the hoarding and found myself in the belly of the beast. The silence inside was absolute, broken only by the occasional groan of the building settling under its own weight. It was the sound of a giant trying to find a comfortable position on a bed of needles. I navigated the ground floor by touch and memory, moving past stacks of drywall and crates of substandard steel. My phone buzzed in my pocket, the vibration startlingly loud in the stillness. I'm on the 12th floor, the cantilever section. I looked up. The 12th floor was where the building jutted out over the street, a daring architectural flourish that required perfect tension to maintain its balance. It was the most vulnerable point in the entire structure. I found the construction elevator, but I didn't use it. The mechanical whine would telegraph my position to anyone within 5 blocks. Instead, I took the emergency stairs, my breath coming in shallow, controlled bursts. By the time I reached the 12th floor, my thighs were burning, but my mind was sharp. The floor was open to the elements, a vast expanse of concrete and shadow overlooking the city lights. I saw a figure standing at the very edge of the cantilever, silhouetted against the neon glow of the downtown district. "You're late, Sawyer," a voice said. It was Clara. She wasn't wearing her hard hat or her surveyor's vest. She was in a dark peacoat, her hands shoved deep into her pockets. She didn't turn around as I approached. "I like to check the perimeter before I enter a trap," I said, stopping 10 feet behind her. "It's a habit. Keeps the walls from closing in." Clara finally turned, her face pale in the reflected light of the city. She didn't look like the practical engineer I'd talked to earlier. She looked weary, her eyes carrying the weight of a secret that had finally become too heavy to hold. "It's not a trap," she said quietly. "But it is a disaster. You think Marcus is the only one who betrayed you? You think this started with the Pierpont project?" "I know he took the firm, Clara. I know he's using Apex alloys to funnel money into his own pockets. I have the paper trail." "The paper trail you found is just the topsoil, Sawyer. You're an architect. You should know that the deepest rot is always in the footings. Marcus didn't just decide to freeze you out 6 months ago. He was approached by a group of developers 3 years ago, back when you were still designing the library annex. They wanted this site, but they didn't want your integrity slowing down the timeline. They needed a front man who would sign off on whatever shortcuts they required." I felt a slow, grinding sensation in my chest, like gears stripped of their teeth. 3 years. While I was sharing coffee with Marcus and discussing the ethics of urban density, he was already laying the groundwork for my removal. "And who are these developers?" I asked. Clara reached into her coat and pulled out a manila envelope. She held it out, but she didn't let go of it immediately when I reached for it. "Once you open this, there's no going back to your quiet life in that walk-up, Sawyer. These people don't just sue you, they ruin you socially, professionally, and legally until there's nothing left but a shell. I'm already a shell, Clara. Marcus took the meat. Now I'm just looking for the satisfaction of the snap." I took the envelope. Inside was a series of wire transfer records and a copy of a partnership agreement that predated our firm's split by 18 months. The names on the documents made my jaw tighten. One of them was a prominent city councilman. Another was the CEO of the very firm Sienna worked for. The layers of the betrayal were shifting, revealing a complex web of collusion that made Marcus look like a minor character. My sister hadn't just been neglecting her kids. She'd been working for the people who were actively dismantling my career. Whether she knew it or not was irrelevant. She was a cog in the machine that had crushed me. "Why are you giving me this?" I asked, looking at Clara. "Because I'm the one who signed off on the steel reports before I knew what they were doing," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I thought it was just a minor clerical error. By the time I realized the scale of the fraud, they had enough on me to make sure I'd never work again. But I can't watch this building go up, knowing what's inside it. It's a hollow promise, Sawyer. It's a tomb for a reputation, I corrected her. Suddenly, the heavy thud of a car door echoed from the street below. We both froze, moving to the edge of the floor to look down. A black sedan had pulled up behind my car. 2 men stepped out. Even from 12 stories up, I recognized the gait of the man in the lead. Marcus. He wasn't alone. He was accompanied by a man I didn't recognize, tall, broad-shouldered, carrying himself with the practiced ease of someone paid to handle complications. "They followed you," Clara whispered, her face going white. "No," I said, watching them approach the gate. "They followed the digital breadcrumbs I left him at the Blue Room. I wanted him to come here. I just didn't think he'd bring company." I looked at Clara. "Get to the stairs. Go down to the 4th floor and use the service exit I came in through. Don't look back." "What about you?" "I'm going to have a conversation with an old friend about the strength of his materials." Clara didn't argue. She disappeared into the darkness of the stairwell, her footsteps fading quickly. I turned back to the open floor, my mind racing. I was outnumbered, but I had the advantage of the environment. I knew every corner, every weak point, every hidden alcove of this building. Marcus thought he owned the Pierpont, but I was the one who had breathed life into it. I moved to the center of the floor, near a stack of heavy industrial cable spools. I took a length of high-tension wire and began to loop it between 2 support columns at ankle height, creating a tripwire in the shadows. Then, I moved a heavy rolling cart filled with scrap metal near the edge of the stairwell door. I heard the elevator groan to life. Marcus was taking the easy way up. I waited in the darkness behind a concrete pillar. The elevator bell chimed, a cheerful, incongruous sound in the middle of a skeletal floor. The doors slid open, throwing a rectangular beam of light across the dust-covered floor. Marcus stepped out first, his face twisted in a mask of frustrated rage. The man behind him was holding a heavy flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark like a blade. "Sawyer!" Marcus yelled, his voice echoing off the unfinished walls. "I know you're up here. You want to talk about Apex alloys? Let's talk. Let's talk about what happens to people who stick their noses into multi-million-dollar investments." I stayed silent, watching the beam of the flashlight sweep the room. It passed over my pillar, missing me by inches. "He's here, Marcus," the other man said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. I can smell the sweat. They began to move into the room. I waited until they were 20 feet from the elevator, right where the shadows were deepest. "You always were a loudmouth, Marcus," I said, my voice projected so it seemed to come from the opposite corner of the floor. "Even in college, you couldn't keep a secret to save your life. That's why you're so bad at this." The flashlight swung toward the sound. Marcus flinched. "You think you're smart, Beck? You think you can just send an email and ruin me? I built this. This is my legacy." "It's a pile of scrap metal held together by luck and lies," I said, moving silently to a new position. "And the luck just ran out." The large man started toward my voice, moving with surprising speed. He didn't see the wire. His boot caught the tensioned cable, and he went down hard, his flashlight skittering across the concrete. The light spun wildly, illuminating the ceiling in jagged flashes. "Hey!" the man grunted, struggling to find his footing in the dark. I stepped out from behind the pillar and kicked the rolling cart of scrap. It surged forward, the wheels shrieking on the concrete, and slammed into the man's legs just as he was trying to stand. He tumbled backward into a pile of empty crates with a deafening crash. Marcus screamed, a high-pitched sound of pure panic. He turned to run back to the elevator, but I was already there. I stepped into the light, my face set in a grim, sarcastic smile. "Leaving so soon?" I asked. Marcus swung a wild, clumsy punch at me. I stepped inside his reach, grabbed his lapels, and used his own momentum to shove him back toward the edge of the cantilever. He stumbled, his heels catching on the lip of the concrete. He flailed his arms, looking down at the 12-story drop to the street. "Sawyer, stop, please." I gripped his jacket tightly, holding him balanced on the precipice. The wind whipped between us, tugging at his hair. For a moment, we were the only 2 people in the world. "The steel, Marcus," I said, my voice barely a whisper against the gale. "Tell me the truth about the councilman." I can't. They'll ruin me." "They've already ruined you," I said, giving him a slight, terrifying nudge. "I'm just the one presiding over the collapse. Tell me what I want to know, or I let go, and we see if those Apex alloys railings I saw downstairs can actually hold a man's weight." Marcus's eyes were darting everywhere, looking for his hired help, but the man was still groaning in the pile of crates, buried under 100 pounds of scrap. "It was a land swap," Marcus blurted out, his voice cracking. "The councilman approved the zoning in exchange for a 20% stake in the shell company. Sienna's boss handled the escrow. They're all in on it, Sawyer. Every single one of them." I pulled him back from the edge and threw him onto the dusty floor. He collapsed into a heap, sobbing and gasping for air. I took out my phone. I'd been recording the whole thing. Thanks for the statement, Marcus. I think the investors will find this much more illuminating than your lunch pitch. I heard the man in the crates finally shove the metal aside, his breathing heavy and angry. It was time to go. I headed for the stairs, my heart hammering a steady, rhythmic beat against my ribs. I had the names, I had the confession, and I had the leverage. The underdog wasn't just barking anymore. He had torn the throat out of the master's plan. As I reached the ground floor and slipped out into the cold night air, I felt a strange sense of clarity. The revenge wasn't over. It was just scaling up. Next step, I whispered to the empty street. The councilman. The morning air felt like a sheet of chilled glass against my face as I sat in my car, parked 2 blocks away from City Hall. I had the recording of Marcus saved in 3 different cloud drives and a physical backup tucked into the lining of my laptop bag. In the architectural world, we talk about catastrophic failure, the moment a structure moves past the point of no return. Marcus had reached that point on the 12th floor of the Pierpont, but he was just a single pillar. To bring down the entire corrupt edifice, I had to find the keystone. Councilman Jeffrey Sterling was a man who built his reputation on the concept of urban revitalization. He was the face of every new park, every subsidized housing complex, and every ribbon-cutting ceremony in the district. He had a smile that looked like it had been polished by a professional stonemason, and a handshake that felt like a legal guarantee. But according to the files Clara gave me and Marcus's frantic confession, Sterling was the silent architect of the land swap that had turned my career into a pile of rubble. I checked my watch. Sterling had a standing breakfast meeting at the Heritage Club every Tuesday at 8. It was a place where the air was thick with the smell of expensive coffee and the sound of quiet, consequential decisions. I wasn't invited, but I knew the building's layout. I had consulted on the HVAC restoration for the Heritage back when I was still the rising star of Beck and Hale. I knew exactly how to navigate the service corridors to reach the private dining alcoves without passing the concierge. I stepped out of the car, adjusting the strap of my messenger bag. I felt a strange, humming stillness in my nerves. The frantic anger of the previous months had settled into something more durable, a cold, structural resolve. I entered through the delivery bay, nodding to a laundry worker pushing a cart of linen. I looked like I belonged there. I had the tired eyes and the functional clothes of a man who fixed things. I took the service stairs to the mezzanine level. From the utility balcony, I could look down into the main dining room. It was a sea of white tablecloths and hushed voices. Sterling was easy to spot. He was seated in the corner alcove, his silver hair gleaming under the chandeliers. Across from him was a woman I recognized instantly, Diane Vane, the CEO of the real estate firm where my sister worked. Seeing them together was like seeing the final piece of a jigsaw puzzle click into place. They weren't just colleagues. They were the primary investors in the shell company that had profited from the Pierpont's substandard materials. While Marcus was the one cutting the checks, they were the ones providing the cover. I moved down the back hallway, entering the pantry area behind the alcoves. A young waiter was preparing a tray of fruit. I stepped beside him, my expression one of professional urgency. The councilman needs the updated zoning maps for the Pierpont discussion, I said, holding up a sleek, unmarked tablet. I'll take the tray in. Go check on the coffee service for table 4. The waiter, likely exhausted and happy to shed a task, nodded and handed me the silver tray. I took a steadying breath, balanced the tray on my left hand, and stepped through the velvet curtains into the alcove. "The fruit you requested, Councilman," I said, my voice smooth and anonymous. Sterling didn't even look up. He was leaning forward, his voice a low rumble. "We need to accelerate the inspection schedule, Diane. If those rumors about the alloy specifications start circulating in the press, the whole project becomes a liability." "Marcus is handling the rumors," Diane replied, her tone sharp and impatient. "He's already threatened the lead engineer. The problem is Sawyer Beck. He's been poking around the server logs." "Beck is a non-entity," Sterling dismissed him with a wave of his hand. "He's a freelancer with a ruined reputation. Who's going to listen to a man who couldn't even keep his own partner loyal?" I set the tray down on the table with a sharp, deliberate clink. The sound was like a hammer hitting a nail. Both of them looked up, their expressions shifting from irritation to stunned recognition. "Good morning, Councilman," I said, pulling a chair from the adjacent table and sitting down. I didn't wait for an invitation. "I couldn't help but overhear. It's fascinating how you talk about liability while sitting in a building that actually follows the safety codes." Sterling's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. "Beck, what the hell is this? Security." "Security is currently busy with the coffee service," I said, leaning back and crossing my legs. I pulled the tablet from my bag and laid it on the table between them. And before you make a scene, you might want to look at the screen. It's a live feed of a data transfer. If my finger leaves this button, a very detailed folder containing your wire transfers to Apex Alloys goes directly to the district attorney's office and the lead editor of the City Gazette. Diane Vane didn't flush like Sterling. She went pale, her eyes darting to the tablet. She was a woman who lived by the numbers, and she knew exactly what those numbers meant. "You're bluffing," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. "I'm an architect, Diane. I don't build on speculation. I build on facts," I said. I tapped a button on the screen, and Marcus's voice filled the small alcove. It was the recording from the 12th floor, shaky, distorted by the wind, but unmistakably Marcus confessing to the land swap and the councilman's involvement. Sterling looked like he was about to have a physical crisis. His polished facade was cracking, revealing the panicked, small-minded man beneath. "What do you want, Beck? Money? We can settle this. Name a figure." "I don't want your money, Jeffrey. Your money is as hollow as the steel in the Pierpont's east wing," I said. I felt a surge of cold satisfaction as I watched him tremble. "I want the truth. I want a signed statement admitting to the zoning fraud and the use of substandard materials. And I want Diane to personally oversee the termination of Marcus Hale's contract." "I can't do that," Diane hissed. "That would expose the entire firm to litigation." "The firm is already exposed," I replied. "The only question is whether you go down with the building or if you're the one who provides the controlled demolition. If you cooperate, I might forget to include your personal escrow signatures in the final leak. If you don't, I'll make sure your name is the first one the morning news mentions when they talk about the sinking skyscraper." The silence in the alcove was absolute. Outside the curtains, the mundane sounds of the city continued, clinking silverware, the hum of traffic, the distant siren of an ambulance. But inside this small velvet box, a career was being dismantled. "I need time," Sterling stammered. "You have 10 minutes, I said, checking my watch. "There's a business center on the second floor with a notary. You're going to go there, you're going to write the statement, and you're going to sign it. Diane will witness. If I don't have that paper in my hand by 8:40, the upload completes." I stood up, leaving the tablet on the table as a reminder of the ticking clock. "And just so we're clear, if either of you tries to call your security friends or Marcus's hired help, the file sends immediately. I have a heartbeat monitor app linked to the server. If my pulse spikes or the phone is dropped, the truth goes public." It was a lie, of course. I didn't have a heartbeat monitor. But they didn't know that. They were people who lived in fear of exposure, and they assumed everyone else was as devious as they were. I walked out of the alcove and back through the pantry. My heart was thumping, but it wasn't the frantic beat of a victim. It was the steady rhythm of a man who had finally reclaimed the lead. I waited in the mezzanine hallway, hidden behind a decorative marble pillar. 5 minutes passed, then 7. Finally, Sterling and Diane emerged from the alcove. They looked like they were walking to a sentencing hearing. They headed for the stairs, their movements stiff and mechanical. I followed at a distance. I watched them enter the business center. I watched through the glass partition as Sterling sat at a computer, his hands shaking as he typed. Diane stood over him, her face a mask of cold fury. They were two predators who had finally been cornered by the person they'd spent years dismissing as a non-entity. While they were occupied, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "The councilman isn't your only problem. Marcus is at your apartment. He's looking for the physical backups. Get there now." The clarity of the situation shifted. Marcus wasn't going to wait for the legal fallout. He was desperate, and a desperate man with a background in construction knew exactly how to break things. I didn't wait for Sterling to finish. I knew he was trapped. Diane would make sure he signed that paper to save her own skin. I ran for the service exit, my boots pounding on the stairs. I burst out into the alleyway and scrambled into my car. I tore through the city streets, weaving through traffic with a reckless precision. My apartment was in an old brownstone on the edge of the district, a place with creaky floors and thin walls. It wasn't a fortress. When I turned onto my street, I saw Marcus's black SUV idling at a fire hydrant. The driver's side door was open. I didn't stop to think. I jammed the car into park and sprinted toward the front door of the building. The lock on the main entrance had been jimmied. I took the stairs 3 at a time, my lungs burning. When I reached the 4th floor, I saw my apartment door standing ajar. The wood around the frame was splintered. I stepped inside, my movements quiet and deliberate. The apartment was a wreck. My drafting table had been overturned, the blueprints scattered like fallen leaves. My bookshelves had been emptied, and my laptop lay smashed in the center of the room, its screen a spiderweb of fractured glass. Marcus was in the small kitchenette, his back to me. He was tearing through the cabinets, throwing plates and glasses onto the floor. He looked wild, his suit jacket discarded, his shirt drenched in sweat. "Looking for something, Marcus?" I asked, my voice echoing in the ruined room. He spun around, a heavy iron skillet in his hand. His eyes were bloodshot, and he was breathing in ragged, shallow gasps. "Where are they, Sawyer? Where are the hard drives? I know you didn't put everything on the cloud. You're too paranoid for that." "You're right," I said, stepping over a pile of broken ceramics. "I am paranoid. That's why the drives aren't here. They're in a safety deposit box that only opens with a biometric scan." Another lie. They were actually tucked inside the hollow leg of the drafting table he'd just knocked over, but he was too blinded by panic to see the obvious. "You think you've won?" Marcus snarled, stepping toward me. He raised the skillet, his knuckles white. "You think you can just walk away after what you did to me at the Blue Room? After what you did at the site?" "I didn't do anything to you, Marcus. I just showed you the reflection of your own work. You're the one who chose the materials. You're the one who signed the contracts." He lunged at me, swinging the skillet with a clumsy overhead arc. I stepped back, the heavy iron whistling past my ear. He was strong, but he was uncoordinated, driven by adrenaline rather than intent. He stumbled into the counter, and I used the opportunity to grab his arm, twisting it behind his back. We struggled in the narrow space, the sound of our breathing the only noise in the room. He was heavy, but I was motivated by a decade of suppressed frustration. I slammed him against the refrigerator, the magnetic calendar on the door clattering to the floor. "It's over, Marcus," I hissed into his ear. "Sterling is signing the confession right now. Diane has already cut you loose. You're the structural failure they're going to blame for everything." He stopped fighting. The tension left his body all at once, and he slumped against the appliance. The skillet clattered to the floor. He looked down at his hands, which were shaking uncontrollably. "They'll leave me with nothing," he whispered. "No," I said, releasing him and stepping back. "They'll leave you with exactly what you gave me, a ruined name and a lot of empty space." I looked around my ruined apartment. It was a mess, but it was just property. The integrity of the situation remained intact. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. "I'm calling the police now, Marcus. Not for the fraud. That's for the DA to handle. I'm calling them for the breaking and entering. I think you should leave before they get here. It would be a shame for the neighbors to see you like this." Marcus didn't say a word. He grabbed his jacket from the floor and walked out of the apartment. His head bowed. I stood in the middle of the wreckage, listening to his footsteps fade down the stairs. The phone in my hand vibrated. A new message from the unknown number. Sterling signed. "Diane is at the firm now, purging the files. But there's one more layer you haven't seen. Check the floorboards under your drafting table. Look for the blue folder." I walked over to the overturned table. I knelt in the dust and the scattered paper. I found the loose board I'd never noticed before, a flaw in the original construction of the brownstone. I pried it up. Inside was a thin blue folder. I opened it and felt a cold, sharp sensation of pure shock. It wasn't a business document. It was a life insurance policy and a series of personal letters. The name on the policy wasn't Marcus or Sterling. It was my father's. And the beneficiary wasn't me. It was the CEO of Diane's firm. The betrayal didn't start 3 years ago. It started before I was even an architect. I closed the folder, my mind spinning with the implications. The revenge had just reached its apex. The blue folder sat on the dusty floorboards like a live wire, humming with the potential to shock the entire foundation of my memory. I stared at the signature on the bottom of the life insurance policy. It was my father's, but the ink was shaky, a stark contrast to the firm, architectural hand he had used to teach me how to draw a straight line. The beneficiary was indeed Elias Thorne, the founding partner of the firm Diane Vane now managed. It wasn't just a business arrangement, it was a harvest. My father's career hadn't ended because of a sudden loss of talent or a change in the market. It had been dismantled, piece by piece, to fuel the growth of Thorne's empire. I stood up, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The apartment was a ruin of shattered glass and overturned memories. But the clarity I felt was sharper than any of the shards on the floor. I didn't call the police on Marcus. I didn't call Sienna. I didn't even call Clara. I realized that the people I had been fighting, Marcus, Sterling, even my sister, were merely the gargoyles on a much larger, much older structure. To truly finish this, I had to confront the architect of the entire system. I grabbed the folder and my messenger bag, stepping over the wreckage of my life. I didn't head for the office or the construction site. I drove to the waterfront, to the Thorne estate, a sprawling glass and steel monstrosity that sat on the edge of the cliffs like a predator watching the tide. It was a private residence, guarded by automated gates and a security system that likely cost more than my entire apartment building. As I drove, I felt the familiar sarcastic commentary of my inner monologue beginning to soften into something more focused. I had spent years thinking I was the underdog because of bad luck or a lack of social grace. I thought my cynicism was a shield, but looking at that blue folder, I realized my cynicism was actually a premonition. I had always known the world was built on uneven ground. I just hadn't realized my own family had been used as the fill. I pulled up to the main gate. The intercom crackled with a sterile electronic hiss. "State your name and business." "Sawyer Beck. I have the blueprints for the Pierpont project and a legacy document that belongs to Elias Thorne," I said, pitching my voice to sound like a man who was already expected. There was a long pause, the kind of silence that happens when a computer is processing a massive amount of data. Then, the heavy wrought iron gates swung open with a hydraulic groan. I drove up the winding driveway, past manicured lawns and stone statues that looked like they were mourning the very ground they stood on. Elias Thorne was waiting for me on the terrace. He was a man who looked like he had been carved out of flint, sharp, gray, and entirely unaffected by the elements. He was 80 years old, but he sat in his chair with the rigidity of a structural beam. Diane Vane was standing behind him, her face a mask of professional neutrality, though her eyes flared with a brief flicker of alarm when she saw me. "Mr. Beck," Thorne said, his voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "I was told you were causing quite a disturbance at the Heritage Club this morning, and I understand you've had a disagreement with Mr. Hale at your apartment." "Disagreement is a mild word for it, Elias," I said, walking across the terrace. I didn't wait for him to offer a seat. I stood at the edge of the stone railing, looking out at the gray expanse of the ocean. I'd call it a stress test, and as it turns out, Marcus Hale has the structural integrity of wet cardboard. "Sawyer, you're overstepping," Diane warned, her voice tight. "We have the statement from the councilman. We are already moving to address the material issues at the Pierpont. There's no need for further escalation." "I think there's plenty of room for escalation," I said, turning to face them. I tossed the blue folder onto the table. It slid across the polished wood, stopping inches from Thorne's withered hand. "Let's talk about the 1998 Annex project. Let's talk about why my father's signature is on a policy that paid out to this firm when he was forced into early retirement." Thorne didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the folder. "Your father was a brilliant man, Sawyer, but he was fragile. He couldn't handle the pressures of the modern industry. We provided him with an exit that ensured his family would be taken care of." "You provided him with a cage," I countered. "You used his designs, you took his reputation, and when he was no longer useful, you made sure he was legally bound to remain silent. And now you're doing the same thing with the Pierpont, only this time you used Marcus to do the dirty work so you could keep your hands clean." Thorne smiled, a thin, mirthless line. "In this business, Sawyer, you are either the one who draws the lines or the one who is erased by them. You've spent your life being erased. Why change now?" "Because I found the eraser," I said. I pulled my phone out and tapped the screen. "Diane, did you check the server logs before you left the office? Or did you just assume the purge worked?" Diane's brow furrowed. "I saw the confirmation. The files are gone." "The files on the main server are gone," I agreed. "But I didn't send the data to the main server. I used the HVAC control system as a bridge. Every invoice from Apex Alloys, every email between you and Sterling, and every record of the land swap is currently being hosted on the digital display of every smart thermostat in the Pierpont building. And since today is the press walkthrough for the investors, I imagine a lot of people are going to be very curious about why the temperature controls are scrolling through evidence of corporate fraud." Diane's face went from pale to a ghostly, translucent white. She reached for her phone, her fingers fumbling with the screen. "It's a closed loop, Diane," I said, feeling a surge of that cold, architectural satisfaction. "You can't shut it down from here. You'd have to go to the site and manually reset the local nodes. But of course, the site is currently being locked down by the city building inspectors. I sent them a tip about the alloy swap an hour ago. They're very thorough when they think their own professional licenses are on the line." Thorne finally looked at me, his gray eyes sharpening. "You've ruined the project? Do you realize the financial loss you've just caused? Thousands of people will be out of work. The firm will collapse." "The firm is already a hollow shell, Elias. I'm just letting the air out," I said. I stepped closer to him, leaning over the table. "And as for the financial loss, I think the insurance policy you took out on my father should cover the legal fees. I've already forwarded a copy of that folder to the state insurance board. They have a very dim view of beneficiary fraud, especially when it involves coerced signatures." The silence on the terrace was absolute. The wind sighed through the glass walls of the mansion, a lonely, hollow sound. Thorne looked at the folder, then at me. For the first time, I saw the age in his face. He wasn't a pillar. He was just an old man who had spent his life building a fortress out of other people's bones. "What do you want, Sawyer?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "I want the keys," I said. "I want a full public admission that the Pierpont design was stolen and compromised. I want the firm dissolved, and I want you to tell my sister exactly how you used her to keep tabs on me. I want her to know that her career was just a leash." "You're destroying everything," Diane whispered, looking at the view of the city she had tried to own. "I'm clearing the site," I corrected her. "You can't build something honest until you get rid of the rot." And I turned and walked away. I didn't look back at the gray man in the chair or the woman who had traded her integrity for a corner office. I walked back to my car, the gravel crunching under my boots with a sound of finality. I drove back toward the city. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the skyline. As I passed the Pierpont, I saw the flashing lights of the building inspectors' vehicles. A crowd had gathered at the gates, investors, reporters, and curious onlookers. The smart displays in the lobby were likely flashing the names of everyone who had tried to bury me. My phone buzzed. It was Sienna. I unblocked her for just a moment to see the message. "Sawyer, please." "Vanessa just took my biggest listing. My boss told me I'm under internal review. What is happening? Why is the firm being investigated?" I didn't reply. I simply sent her a link to the news feed that was just beginning to break the story of the Pierpont scandal. She would figure it out, or she wouldn't. It didn't matter anymore. The structural support I had provided her for years was gone. She was on her own. I drove to a small park overlooking the river, far away from the chaos of the downtown district. I sat on a bench, the blue folder resting on my lap. I felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't the peace of a man who had won a prize. It was the peace of a man who had finally finished a difficult, grueling project. I looked at the city, the lights beginning to twinkle like a million tiny stars caught in a web of steel. It was a beautiful view, but I could see the stress points. I could see where the ground was soft and where the foundations were strong. I took a deep breath, the cool night air filling my lungs. The revenge was complete. The betrayers were ruined, the secrets were out, and the old guard was falling. But as I sat there, I realized that a cleared sight is just the beginning. A shadow fell over me. I didn't have to look up to know who it was. "You did it," Clara said, sitting down on the bench beside me. She looked exhausted, but her eyes were clear. "The board just announced they're filing for bankruptcy. Marcus is being questioned by the DA, and Sterling just resigned his seat." "The structure was compromised," I said, my voice quiet. It was only a matter of time before it fell. "What now, Sawyer?" I looked at the blue folder. I thought about my father's shaky signature. I thought about the years I had spent as a freelancer, scraping by while other people lived in the houses I had designed. "Now," I said, a slow, sarcastic smile returning to my lips. "I think I'm going to build something that actually stays up." "With what?" she asked. I reached into my bag and pulled out the signed confession from Sterling and the wire transfer records. "I think these are worth a lot more than a settlement, Clara. They're the permits for a new firm, a firm with only one rule." "And what's that?" "No hollow beams," I said. The city lights blurred as the first few drops of rain began to fall, washing away the dust of the day. The long game was over, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't just the architect, I was the owner. The rain had turned into a steady, rhythmic drumming against the roof of my car as I sat in the parking lot of the Pierpont construction site. This was the apex. Every calculation, every social sabotage, and every digital leak had been leading to this specific coordinate in time and space. The building was no longer a project. It was a crime scene of corporate negligence, cordoned off by high-visibility tape that fluttered in the wind like yellow snakes. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked like a man who had finally stopped trying to fix a sinking ship and had instead decided to build a lighthouse on the shore. I stepped out of the car, the cool water soaking through my jacket. I didn't head for the service entrance this time. I walked straight to the main gate. The security guard, a man who had seen my face on the news 3 times in the last 6 hours, didn't even try to stop me. He simply unlatched the chain and stepped aside, his expression one of weary respect. Inside the perimeter, the silence was different than it had been at midnight. It wasn't the silence of sleep, it was the silence of a vacuum created by a sudden loss of power. I climbed the stairs to the main lobby, where the glass walls met the reinforced concrete. Standing in the center of the vast, hollow space were the 3 people who had spent the last decade trying to erase me. Marcus Hale stood near a stack of crates, his expensive suit stained with dust and rain. Councilman Sterling was slumped on a folding chair, his head in his hands, looking like a monument that had been toppled from its pedestal. And Sienna, my sister, stood by the far window, staring out at the city she had tried so hard to impress. "You called us all here, Sawyer," Marcus said, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. He sounded hollow, stripped of the bravado that had defined him. What else is there to say? You've ruined us. The firm is gone. Sterling is finished. My career is a pile of ash. Is that enough for you? I walked to the center of the room, my boots echoing with a steady, deliberate click. I didn't ruin you, Marcus. I just stopped holding you up. There's a difference. I looked at Sterling, who didn't even look up. The confession you signed this morning has already been authenticated. The DA's office is reviewing the land swap documents as we speak. You'll never hold office again, Jeffrey. You won't even be able to get a permit for a garden shed in this city. Sienna turned away from the window, her eyes red and swollen. And me? Was I just a stress point in your little experiment, Sawyer? I'm your sister. You were the person who thought my time and my life were assets you could borrow without interest, I said, my voice calm. You didn't care about the kids being on that porch. You only cared that you were caught. You worked for Diane Vane, knowing what she did to our father's reputation. You traded loyalty for a seat at a table that was built on stolen designs. I didn't know, she shouted, her voice cracking. You chose not to know, I countered. In architecture, we call that willful ignorance of the site conditions. It's the fastest way to make a structure fail. I pulled a thick stack of documents from my bag and laid them on a makeshift table, a sheet of plywood resting on 2 sawn-off beams. This is the final report. It contains every piece of evidence I've gathered. The Apex Alloy invoices, the wire transfers, the insurance fraud from 1998, and the recorded confession. I've already sent copies to the relevant authorities. Then why are we here? Marcus asked, his voice trembling. To watch you gloat? No, I said, leaning over the table. I'm here to give you the final walkthrough. I want you to see exactly how this building is going to be saved. They looked at me with confusion. The Pierpont isn't going to be demolished, I continued. The city is going to seize the asset under the emergency safety statutes. I've already spent the last 4 hours on the phone with the City Planning Commission. Because the design is technically mine, and because I'm the only one who knows the exact location of every substandard beam Marcus installed, they've appointed me as the lead consultant for the structural remediation. Marcus let out a short, bitter laugh. So you win. You get the building back. I get the responsibility back, I corrected him. The profits from the completion of this project will be diverted into a trust for the families who were displaced by Sterling's land swap scheme. And as for the firm, it's being reorganized. Clara Monroe will be the managing partner. I'll just be the one who ensures the foundations are honest. I looked at Marcus. You're going to spend the next few years answering questions in rooms with very uncomfortable chairs. You'll lose your license, your house, and your car. But you'll be alive to see this building stand. And every time you look at the skyline, you'll know that it's standing because I fixed what you broke. Marcus lunged at me, a desperate animal snarl escaping his throat. He was fast, but he was driven by nothing but blind, uncoordinated rage. I didn't even have to move much. I just stepped to the side and used his momentum to guide him into the concrete pillar behind me. He hit the stone with a dull thud and slumped to the floor, clutching his shoulder. The integrity of this building is fine, Marcus, I said, looking down at him. It's the people inside who are failing the load test. I turned to Sienna. Go home. Take care of your children. Actually take care of them. If I ever hear about them being left on a stranger's doorstep again, I won't call you. I'll call the people who can actually protect them. She stared at me for a long moment, looking for a trace of the nice guy she had exploited for years. She didn't find him. She turned and walked toward the exit, her head bowed. Sterling was the last one. He finally looked up, his face a map of ruin. You think you've changed the world, Beck? You've just cleared one little corner of the playground. There are 1,000 more like me. Then I'll just have to keep my tools sharp, won't I? I said. Now get out of my building. Sterling stood up, his movements slow and shaky. He walked past me without a word, vanishing into the gray mist of the lobby entrance. I was alone in the center of the Pierpont. The rain continued to fall, but inside, the air was still. I walked to the edge of the floor, looking out at the city. The lights were coming on, one by one, a grid of electricity and ambition. For years, I had viewed the city as a hostile environment, a place where the shadows were deeper than the light. But now, I saw it differently. It was a site in progress. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my father's old drafting pencil, the one with the worn grip and the lead that never snapped. I laid it on the plywood table. The long game was over. The betrayals had been addressed, the social consequences had been delivered, and the structural flaws had been exposed. I felt a sense of lightness that I hadn't known since I was a student, drawing my first perfect circle. I wasn't just an architect who had survived. I was an architect who had redefined the ground he stood on. I looked up at the ceiling, at the vast network of steel and concrete that stretched into the darkness. It was a beautiful structure, or it would be, once the rot was replaced with something solid. "Time to get to work," I whispered. I walked toward the exit, my footsteps echoing with a sound of absolute certainty. As I stepped out into the rain, I didn't feel the cold. I felt the friction of the world, and for the first time in my life, I knew exactly how to use it to stay upright. The city was waiting, and I had the blueprints for a brand new day. I climbed into my car, started the engine, and drove away from the site. I didn't look back at the yellow tape or the flashing lights. I looked forward, toward the horizon where the dark clouds were finally beginning to break, revealing a thin, silver line of morning light. The underdog wasn't at the bottom of the pile anymore. He was the one who had designed the peak.